He was a millionaire with everything society admired: wealth, status, the perfect public image. I was his secret, hidden behind closed doors. Our love burned bright in the shadows, but when the spotlight threatened to expose us, I learned the painful price of loving someone who couldn't love me openly. I still remember the weight of his gaze from across the ballroom, the way time seemed to slow as our eyes locked through the crowd of designer gowns and tailored suits. That moment, that single electric moment, was the beginning of everything that would both build me up and break me apart. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Jasmine, and on paper, I was living the dream. Executive position at a marketing firm I'd helped build from the ground up. Condo overlooking the city, the kind of wardrobe my younger self could only fantasize about while flipping through magazines. I'd fought my way through a world that wasn't designed for women who looked like me, and I wore my success like armor. That night at the Metropolitan Children's Foundation Gala, I wasn't looking for love. I was there as a board member, focused on securing donations and networking with potential clients. When you've spent years being the only Black woman in boardrooms full of white men, you learn to carry yourself with unshakable confidence. Maybe that's what caught his attention. Alexander Reed, 38, self-made tech millionaire with a portfolio of companies that touched everything from sustainable energy to luxury real estate. The kind of man whose name appeared in business journals and whose face occasionally graced charity event photos with vague captions about generous contributions. What those captions never mentioned was the intensity in his eyes when nobody was watching, or the way he could make promises in whispers that felt more binding than contracts. "I've been watching you all night," he said when he finally approached, champagne flute in hand. "You're the most fascinating person in this room." I'd heard lines before, but something about the gentle rasp in his voice made this one land differently. What I didn't know then, couldn't have known, was that watching from a distance would become the foundation of our relationship. That loving him would mean learning to exist in carefully constructed shadows. The warning signs were there from the beginning. The way he introduced me as a colleague to the few acquaintances who approached us, the careful distance he maintained in public, the late-night texts instead of daytime calls. But when we were alone, it was different. When we were alone, I was everything. If you've ever fallen for someone who couldn't fully commit to you, someone who loved you completely behind closed doors but couldn't acknowledge you in the light of day, stay with me. The next chapter of my story might sound familiar. It might even save you years of heartache that I couldn't save myself from. Because loving Alexander taught me that being someone's hidden treasure isn't the same as being their pride and joy, and no amount of private promises can make up for public denial. This is the story of how I learned that lesson the hard way. Our first real date wasn't at a restaurant or a theater. It was at his private beach house in the Hamptons, a modernist structure of glass and steel that seemed to float above the shoreline. "I value my privacy," Alexander explained as he poured me a glass of wine that probably cost more than my first car. "In my position, you learn to be careful about who you let into your world." I understood privacy. As one of few Black female executives in my industry, I'd learned to compartmentalize my life too. The professional woman who commanded boardrooms was different from the woman who called her mother every Sunday, or who sometimes danced alone in her kitchen to Beyoncé. We all have our separate selves. So, when Alexander suggested keeping our relationship discreet, it didn't immediately set off alarms. His world was intoxicating. Private jets to weekend getaways where no one knew our names, intimate dinners prepared by personal chefs in penthouses overlooking cities I'd only dreamed of visiting. Late-night conversations about our childhoods, our ambitions, our fears. Alexander had grown up with money but lost it all when his father's business collapsed. He'd rebuilt everything from scratch, and that hunger for security explained his obsessive work ethic. "You're different," he told me one night as we lay tangled in Egyptian cotton sheets, the Manhattan skyline twinkling beyond his bedroom windows. "Most people want me for what I can give them. You see me for who I am." And I did see him, the insecurities beneath the tailored suits, the boy still trying to prove himself beneath the man everyone admired. In those private moments, the walls came down. He'd trace the curves of my body with reverence, tell me my mind was as beautiful as my skin. When we were alone, I never doubted his feelings. But 3 months in, the patterns became impossible to ignore. Our dates were always at his homes or in private rooms of exclusive restaurants. If we happened to run into someone he knew, I was introduced as a business associate or simply by my first name, with no context. Once, at a gallery opening I'd invited him to, he arrived an hour late and stayed on the opposite side of the room all night, only to text me that he'd meet me at his place afterward. "It's complicated," he said when I finally confronted him. We were sitting on the terrace of his downtown loft, the city humming below us. My investors are conservative. My family has expectations. The board members of my foundation are traditional. Image matters in my world. "And what am I doing to your image?" I asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear him say it. He took my hands, his eyes sincere. "Nothing, you're perfect. But people make assumptions, and those assumptions can affect business relationships. It's not fair, but it's reality." The unspoken truth hung between us, that a serious relationship with a Black woman wasn't part of the life he presented to the world, that loving me was something he did behind closed doors. "We're just getting to know each other," he reasoned. "Why rush to define things or make announcements? What we have is just for us." And because his words felt like silk and his touch like fire, I accepted the terms. Because when he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world, the rest of the world seemed less important. I told myself this was just the beginning, that with time, things would change. I didn't realize I was setting the foundation for a relationship built on shadows, or that you can't grow something healthy in the dark. 6 months in, and I'd fallen. Not the gentle descent of typical relationships, but a free fall into something that consumed me. Alexander had become the center of my universe, the good morning texts I woke up to, the voice that soothed me to sleep at night, the person who understood my ambitions because they mirrored his own. When we were together, the world outside ceased to exist. Maybe that's why I didn't notice how small my world was becoming. Our love flourished in the spaces between public appearances, weekends at remote cabins where no one would recognize him, midnight dinners in private rooms of restaurants where the staff was paid for discretion, stolen moments in his office after everyone had gone home. There was something addictive about the secrecy, the way his eyes would burn into mine across crowded rooms where no one knew we belonged to each other, the hunger in his touch when we finally closed the door on the world. "I've never felt this way about anyone," he whispered against my skin on a private yacht somewhere off the coast of Santorini. We'd flown separate flights to Greece, stayed in separate hotels until boarding his chartered boat. "You know that, right? This isn't just an affair for me." And in those moments, I believed him. Because when we were alone, he was completely mine. The way he memorized every detail about me, from how I took my coffee to the names of childhood friends I'd mentioned once in passing. The way he'd send rare first editions of my favorite books with notes tucked between pages. The way he looked at me sometimes, like he was seeing something precious and rare. But reality has a way of intruding, even on the most beautiful fantasy. Like the night I was working late and saw his photo in a society column, his arm around a willowy blonde at a charity function I hadn't known about. "Business politics," he explained when I confronted him. "Claire's father is an investor. It's all for show." Or the Christmas I spent alone because he was with his family in Aspen, a family I'd never met, though we'd been together nearly a year. "They wouldn't understand what we have," he said. "They're from a different generation." The excuses were always logical, always delivered with such conviction that questioning them made me feel irrational, and always followed by moments so tender that my doubts seemed petty in comparison. "I'm falling in love with you," I admitted one night, the words escaping before I could catch them. We were in his Manhattan apartment, the place that felt most like ours, though my name wasn't on any doorbell or mailbox. He held my face in his hands, eyes solemn. "I already love you, but love isn't always enough in my world. There are expectations, obligations, complications you can't imagine." "Then help me understand," I pleaded. "My family's name, my investors, my public image, they're built on certain perceptions. The world I operate in is traditional. Changing those perceptions takes time." What he didn't say, what hung in the air between his carefully chosen words, was that loving a black woman openly might cost him something he wasn't willing to lose. The realization should have been my exit cue. Instead, it became another secret I kept, even from myself. Because by then, I'd built my happiness around the hours we spent together. I'd rearranged my life to fit into the corners of his, canceled plans with friends for last-minute meetings when his schedule cleared, turned down a conference in London because it conflicted with a weekend he'd set aside for us, and somewhere along the way, I'd started measuring my worth by his validation, the approval in his eyes when I shared work successes, the pride in his voice when he told me I was unlike anyone he'd ever known. What I didn't recognize then was how the secrecy was changing me. How explaining my unavailability to friends meant constructing elaborate lies. How the constant compartmentalization was exhausting me. How waiting for his calls had become the rhythm of my days. I was living for stolen moments, convincing myself they were enough. All while the woman I'd been, independent, ambitious, unapologetic, was slowly disappearing into the shadows where our love lived. The first time I saw Alexander with another woman on social media, my coffee cup slipped from my hand and shattered on my kitchen floor. It wasn't the society pages this time, it was his own Instagram. Alexander Reed, who claimed to value privacy above all else, smiling beside a famous actress at a film premiere. The caption read, "Wonderful evening supporting the arts with the lovely Vanessa Martin." 3,000 likes. Hundreds of comments speculating about their relationship. His PR team responding with playful non-denials. I called him immediately, fingers trembling. "It's nothing," he assured me. "Her publicist arranged it. It's good for both our brands. You know how this works." And I did know because I'd become fluent in the language of our arrangement. I understood that how this works meant he needed to be seen with women who enhanced his public image. Women who weren't me. Once I started paying attention, I couldn't stop seeing it. Alexander's carefully curated public persona was everywhere, speaking at tech conferences where I'd helped him rehearse his talks, attending gallery openings with socialites while I sat at home, featured in magazine profiles that described him as one of the city's most eligible bachelors. Each appearance was a silent confirmation of what I'd known but refused to acknowledge. In the life he showed the world, I didn't exist. "Do you sleep with them?" I asked one night after seeing photos of him leaving a restaurant with a model, whose hand rested comfortably in the crook of his arm, the same arm that had held me just hours before. "Of course not," he said, offended by the question. "Those relationships are purely for optics. What we have is real." But what was real anymore? The Alexander who brought me wildflowers because I'd mentioned once that they reminded me of my grandmother's garden? Or the Alexander who told a podcast host he was married to his work, still searching for the right woman to share his life with? Meanwhile, my own social media remained carefully neutral. No couple photos. No hints of the relationship that consumed my heart. My friends had stopped asking why I was always unavailable on weekends or who I was texting when I smiled at my phone. They'd drawn their own conclusions about my mysterious dating life, and I let them believe whatever they wanted. The truth felt too complicated, too humiliating to explain. One evening, scrolling through comments on Alexander's latest public appearance, I saw someone write, "Power couple alert. They'd have beautiful children." His publicist had liked the comment. I closed the app and stared at my reflection in the darkened screen, wondering when I'd become someone who spied on a life I wasn't part of. The wealth disparity between us, once an afterthought, now felt significant in new ways. It wasn't just about money, it was about power. The power to define our relationship. The power to control when and where we could be together. Even the power to decide what was worth sacrificing for love. "I've been invited to speak at the Women in Business Gala next month," I told him during a rare weeknight dinner at his place. "Would you come? As my date?" It was a test, though I pretended otherwise. His hesitation told me everything before he even spoke. "I have investors flying in that week. You know I'd be there if I could." But he could. We both knew it. What he meant was, he wouldn't risk being publicly connected to me, not even to support my biggest professional achievement to date. That night, lying beside him in bed, I realized the cruel irony of our situation. In private, he praised my ambition, my intelligence, my beauty. He called me extraordinary. But in public, the very qualities he claimed to love became liabilities. my blackness, my outspokenness, my refusal to play small in professional settings. The next morning, I watched him transform from the man who'd whispered, "You're everything," against my skin to the polished entrepreneur the world knew. Expensive watch, tailored suit, practiced smile. He kissed me goodbye in the privacy of his penthouse, then stepped into his waiting car, alone. I stood at the window watching him leave, 17 floors above a city that had no idea we were together. From that height, everything looked small. The people, the cars, the concerns that governed their daily lives. I pressed my palm against the cool glass and wondered if this was how Alexander saw the world. If this was how he saw me. Something beautiful to possess in private, but too small to matter when viewed from the heights of his ambition. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a painful truth. Perhaps the life we shared wasn't just hidden because of external pressures. Perhaps it was hidden because, to him, it just wasn't important enough to risk anything real. It was Alexander's annual charity gala that finally broke us. The irony wasn't lost on me. We'd met at a similar event 2 years earlier, when I was still naive enough to believe that love could transcend the invisible boundaries society draws around us. "You should come," he said casually over breakfast at his place, scrolling through emails on his phone. "It's for a good cause. Your firm could make some valuable connections." I looked up from my coffee, trying to understand what he was offering. "Come as what, exactly?" "As you," he said, glancing up with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "As Jasmine Carter, marketing executive extraordinaire. Not as his girlfriend, not as his partner, not as the woman who knew the sound of his heartbeat when he slept." I should have declined, should have recognized it for what it was, another compromise that chipped away at my dignity. But some desperate part of me thought that maybe, just maybe, this was his way of finally bringing me into his world. That perhaps, after 2 years of shadows, he was ready to stand in the light with me. I spent a small fortune on a dress the color of midnight, had my hair styled in an elegant updo, practiced a smile that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath. I arrived alone, as instructed, checked in as Jasmine Carter, guest, accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, and scanned the room for the face I knew better than my own. I spotted him across the ballroom, surrounded by board members and donors. He caught my eye and gave me the slightest nod. Our secret signal developed over months of public non-acknowledgement. My role was clear: exist in the same space, but maintain our careful distance. For an hour, I played my part perfectly, made small talk with strangers, praised the foundation's work, avoided his orbit while always knowing exactly where he was in the room. And then, halfway through the evening, I saw her, the same actress from his Instagram, Vanessa Martin, making her entrance in a shimmering gold gown. The crowd parted, photographers appeared, and Alexander moved to greet her, kissing both cheeks, his hand lingering at the small of her back as he guided her through the crowd. A waiter with a tray of champagne stopped beside me. "You look like you could use another," he said kindly, noticing my empty glass. I nodded, unable to speak past the knot in my throat. I watched as Alexander introduced Vanessa to the same people I'd met only as a marketing executive. Watched as she took the place beside him that should have been mine. Watched as they posed for photos that would appear in tomorrow's society pages. When she placed her hand on his arm, that casual claim of intimacy, something inside me finally snapped. I don't remember deciding to approach them. One moment I was frozen by the bar, the next I was standing before them, champagne glass in hand, smiling like my face might crack from the effort. "Alexander," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your date?" The flash of panic in his eyes would have been satisfying if it wasn't so painful. "Jasmine," he recovered quickly. "Of course. Vanessa, this is Jasmine Carter, a brilliant marketing executive who's done some consulting for my tech ventures." Consulting? 2 years reduced to a professional transaction. "Lovely to meet you," Vanessa said with genuine warmth that somehow made everything worse. "Are you enjoying the event?" "It's illuminating," I replied, my eyes never leaving Alexander's face. "Really shows where people's priorities lie." The weight of unspoken things hung between us as a photographer approached. Mr. Reed, could we get a few more shots with Ms. Martin for the foundation website? Of course, Alexander responded smoothly, turning away without another glance in my direction. I waited until 3 a.m. to call him, knowing he'd be home by then, knowing he'd still be awake. What were you thinking? He demanded without preamble. You could have caused a scene. Would that have been so terrible? My voice was hollow, drained of the anger that had propelled me earlier. After 2 years, would it be so catastrophic for people to know about us? You know, it's complicated, Jasmine. My investors, the foundation board. Stop. The word came out sharper than I intended. Just stop. We both know what this is about, and it has nothing to do with your investors. You're ashamed of me. That's ridiculous, he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. I love you. Number. You love the idea of me. You love having me in controlled environments where I don't disrupt your carefully constructed image. That's not love, Alexander. That's ownership. The silence stretched between us, filled with 2 years of unspoken truths. I can't change how the world works, he finally said. Some things are just reality. Reality is what we choose, Alex. You've chosen a world where someone like me can never stand beside you in public, and I've chosen to believe I deserved more than that. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what came next. So here's your choice. Either you love me completely, publicly, proudly, without reservation, or you don't love me at all. There's no middle ground anymore. The silence that followed was answer enough. Heartbreak doesn't hit all at once. It comes in waves, in moments when you reach for your phone to share a thought with someone who's no longer there, in the muscle memory of turning toward their side of the bed, in catching yourself smiling at an inside joke only to remember there's no one to share it with anymore. The first month after Alexander was physical pain, actual, tangible aching in my chest that sometimes made it hard to breathe. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., the hour when we used to have our deepest conversations, and stare at the ceiling, wondering if he was awake too, wondering if he missed me the way I missed him, wondering if any of it had been real. He called, of course, sent messages that I read but couldn't bring myself to answer. What was there to say? We'd reached the end of our story, the inevitable conclusion to a relationship built on uneven ground. You need to get back out there, my friend Maya insisted over brunch, 6 weeks after the breakup. The real world is still spinning. The real world. It struck me then how separate my life with Alexander had been from reality. How many experiences I'd missed while waiting for his schedule to clear. How many friends I'd neglected. How many opportunities I'd passed up to accommodate a relationship that existed only in shadows. My therapist, yes, I finally started therapy, helped me see the patterns I'd fallen into, how I'd internalized the idea that I wasn't worthy of public acknowledgement, how I'd accepted crumbs because I'd convinced myself the whole loaf wasn't available to someone like me. What would you tell a friend in your situation, she asked during one session. To know her worth, I answered without hesitation, to demand nothing less than someone who's proud to stand beside her. And why is that advice good enough for everyone but you? There was no easy answer to that question. Just the slow, painful process of rebuilding the woman I'd been before. The woman who'd never have accepted being anyone's secret. 3 months in, I took a solo trip to Paris, a city Alexander and I had visited twice, always staying in separate hotels until we were safely anonymous. I booked the kind of boutique hotel we would have enjoyed together, ate at restaurants where we would have held hands under the table, but this time I wasn't hiding. This time, I was reclaiming places that had been tainted by secrecy. On my last night there, standing on the Pont des Arcs watching the sunset splash gold across the Seine, I realized I hadn't thought about him for hours. It wasn't the end of the pain, but it was the beginning of its transformation into something else. Something that felt strangely like gratitude. Because loving Alexander, for all its heartbreak, had taught me exactly what I wouldn't compromise on again. I didn't expect to see him again, but life has a funny way of bringing full circles. 8 months after our breakup, I was representing my firm at a tech innovation conference when I spotted him across the exhibition hall. Even from a distance, I could tell something had changed. There was a heaviness to his posture that hadn't been there before. Our eyes met through the crowd, That same electric connection that had started everything 2.5 years earlier. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he walked toward me, purposeful and direct, no pretense of coincidental paths crossing. Jasmine, he said, my name carrying the weight of everything that had happened between us. Alexander. I was surprised by how steady my voice remained. You look well, he offered, his eyes taking in the woman I'd become. Stronger, clearer, more myself than I'd been at the end of us. I am well, I confirmed. And it wasn't a lie. He nodded, a flicker of something like regret crossing his face. I made a mistake, he said simply. With you. With everything. 6 months earlier, those words would have unraveled me. Now they were just words, spoken too late. Your company's doing amazing things, I said, choosing kindness over closure. I read about the new initiative in Africa. We've made some changes, he acknowledged, in leadership, in priorities. A pause, heavy with meaning. In what we value. I understood what he wasn't saying, that perhaps he'd learned something too, that maybe our ending had forced him to confront parts of himself he'd kept carefully hidden. We talked for a few minutes more, professional, cordial, two adults acknowledging a shared past without being consumed by it. As we prepared to part ways, he hesitated. Are you seeing anyone? The question slipped out, too personal for our careful conversation. I thought about the man I'd been dating for the past 2 months. An architect who picked me up at my office for lunch dates, who introduced me to his friends without qualification, who posted photos of us together with captions that left no room for misinterpretation. Yes, I said simply. Someone who's proud to be with me. Something flickered across Alexander's face. Recognition, perhaps, of exactly what he'd lost. He nodded once, accepting the gentle rebuke embedded in my answer. As I walked away, I realized I felt no triumph in his regret, no satisfaction in the knowledge that he'd recognized his mistake too late. Just a quiet appreciation for the journey that had brought me here, to a place where I could look at the man who'd broken my heart and wish him well without wishing for his return. Because the real gift of loving Alexander wasn't the time we spent together. It was the woman I became in his absence. A woman who would never again accept love that came with conditions, who would never again hide her light to make someone else comfortable, who understood finally and completely that she deserved to be chosen openly, honestly, without reservation. And that, more than anything else, was worth every tear I'd shed along the way. They say time heals all wounds, but I think that's only partly true. Time doesn't heal what we refuse to acknowledge. The real healing begins when we face our pain directly, when we examine the patterns that led us there, when we make conscious choices about what we'll accept in the future. It's been 2 years since that final conversation with Alexander. Sometimes I still see him in the media, at industry events, occasionally with a new woman on his arm, but those images no longer pierce me the way they once did. They're just photographs of someone I used to know, someone who taught me one of life's most valuable lessons. That love without respect isn't love at all. The relationship I'm in now isn't perfect. No relationship is. We have disagreements. We navigate busy schedules. We sometimes say the wrong things. But there's one fundamental difference that makes everything else manageable. I am never a secret. I am never something to be hidden away or compartmentalized. I am a person who is loved completely, openly, without qualification. Looking back, I can see how easily I fell into the trap of exceptionalism, believing that Alexander's love for me was so extraordinary that it justified extraordinary compromises, that his private adoration somehow made up for his public denial. That being special in secret was better than not being special at all. But genuine love doesn't ask you to make yourself smaller. It doesn't require you to exist only in carefully prescribed spaces. It doesn't thrive in shadows. If you're watching this and recognizing parts of your own story, if you're making excuses for someone who loves you conditionally, who keeps you segregated from the rest of their life, who makes you feel simultaneously special and inadequate, please hear me when I say you deserve more. You deserve someone who is proud to stand beside you, who introduces you without hesitation, who includes you in every aspect of their world. You deserve someone who loves not just parts of you, but all of you, publicly, privately, consistently, Sometimes the hardest part isn't leaving, it's believing that what comes after will be better than what you're giving up. I remember thinking that no one would ever understand me the way Alexander did, that I'd never feel that particular kind of chemistry again, that I was walking away from the great love of my life. And in some ways, perhaps I was. But what I walked toward was something far more valuable, a life where I never have to question my worth, a relationship built on mutual respect and open acknowledgement, a love that doesn't require me to compromise my dignity. The greatest revelation wasn't that I found someone better than Alexander, it was that I became someone better than the woman who accepted Alexander's terms, someone who knows exactly what she brings to the table and isn't afraid to walk away if she's not being valued properly. So, if my story resonates with you, if you recognize yourself in the woman I was, waiting for texts, making excuses, hiding your relationship from friends because the truth was too complicated to explain, I want you to know that there is life after that kind of love. A richer, fuller, more authentic life than you can imagine when you're in the midst of it. Don't settle for being someone's secret. Don't accept love that comes with conditions. Don't waste your precious time waiting for someone to decide you're worth the risk of showing to the world. Because you are already worthy of love that announces itself proudly, of partnership that stands in full daylight, of someone who sees all of you and says not, "This is complicated, but this is exactly what I want." If this story has touched you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe to join me for more conversations about love, self-worth, and the journey to finding relationships that honor rather than diminish us. And remember, the love you accept is the love you believe you deserve. Believe you deserve everything. Thank you for listening to my story. This is Jasmine Carter, signing off, standing in the light, exactly where I belong.